All right, top of the new hour here. And just moments ago, we learned through sources confirming the U.S. and Iran have reached a deal to extend the ceasefire and launch negotiations on Iran's nuclear program. It's believed to be the most significant diplomatic development since this war began 3 months ago today. And that's where we kick things off at this new hour. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Sandra Smith in New York. John, good to be with you.
Good to be with you as well, Sandra. I think the devil will be in the details, though. I'm John Roberts in Washington. This is America Reports. The 60-day memorandum of understanding is still awaiting final approval from President Trump. If it is signed off on by the president, the Strait of Hormuz would be, quote, unrestricted. The American blockade would be lifted, and the U.S. will commit to discuss sanctions relief and the release of frozen Iranian funds.
Mollie Hemingway and former Deputy CENTCOM Commander Mark Fox are here on this breaking news.
But first, let's go to our Trey Yingst. He is live in Tel Aviv with more. What are you hearing over there, Trey?
Hey.
Yeah, John, good afternoon. U.S. officials confirming to Fox News that American and Iranian negotiators have reached a 60-day ceasefire extension, a memorandum of understanding. The question now is whether or not President Trump and Iran's supreme leader, Mustafa Khamenei, will sign off to move this deal forward. As part of the current framework, we are told this would extend the ceasefire and open the Strait of Hormuz. The issue of Iran's nuclear program would be pushed down the road, and already we're starting to see a splinter in the positions, at least announced by Iranian state media and announced by President Trump. You'll remember yesterday during that cabinet meeting, the president said he would not be comfortable with Iran exporting their highly enriched uranium to a third-party country like China or Russia. We do know a top Pakistani diplomat is expected in Washington tomorrow. Some of these finer details will likely be worked out in the days and weeks ahead. But as you said, John, the devil here is the details, because when we look at a situation like this, we have been here before, only to see the Iranians step back at the negotiating table and try to drag things out longer. The other question has to do with enforcement and where President Trump stands in terms of actually enforcing some sort of agreement with the Iranians. What would be considered a ceasefire violation if this agreement is extended? We saw overnight the Iranians launching drones toward a commercial vessel that was trying to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Ultimately, CENTCOM shot down those incoming projectiles and then struck Iranian territory. The Iranians responded with a ballistic missile and drone attack against a U.S. base in Kuwait. And it gives you a sense of just how quickly things can unravel in the region. So again, U.S. sources confirming to Fox News that a 60-day memorandum of understanding was reached between American and Iranian negotiators. The question now, will this agreement be signed off in terms of Tehran and Washington at the very top level agreeing to move forward into this extended ceasefire? John?
All right, so you've been covering this for an awfully long time. You're an expert on the region. In terms of where this goes from here, when, in your recollection, have the Iranians ever negotiated in good faith?
It's a great question, and we don't have a great reference point for it, because the reality is, no matter who you talk to, whether it's sources in the Gulf, here in Israel, or in the United States, there is a consensus about the way the Iranians negotiate. They like to drag out these deals because it puts them in a more advantageous position when they're trying to get what they want at the negotiating table. Look at where things stand right now, John. The Iranian economy is in a free fall. Exports from the country are down 90%. You have crude oil extraction at 50%, half the rate it's supposed to be. And this is a result of the successful U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports. President Trump, when he entered into this ceasefire in the aftermath of Operation Epic Fury, cut off the Iranian economy from the outside world. And he's been cranking up that pressure each and every day. CENTCOM says more than 100 vessels have been turned around. More than 4 were actually stopped in their tracks as a result of CENTCOM ordering strikes or firing toward these ships that were not adhering to their warnings. And so Iran is in a desperate position right now to make an agreement, but they are known for dragging out these types of negotiations. So if ultimately this deal is reached, the big question remains, what will happen to Iran's nuclear program? And it's not just the highly enriched uranium, around 60% purity, that was buried deep underground in the aftermath of Operation Midnight Hammer last summer. It's all enriched material, because if you have uranium enriched at 5, 10, or even 20%, that's just one step away from weapons grade when they can spin that hexafluoride gas in those advanced centrifuges and increase the purity very rapidly in a matter of days, getting closer and closer to weapons grade material. John?
Well, seems promising, at least on the surface. But again, as we pointed out, the devil is in the details. We'll see where this goes. Trey Yingst kicking us off this afternoon. Thank you, Trey. Sandra.
All right, let's bring in Fox News contributor Mollie Hemingway on the news. Mollie, welcome to you. Obviously, this is, as we just detailed, the most significant diplomatic breakthrough since this war began. But does this ultimately just put off the intense negotiations that will still eventually have to happen?
Well, the beginning of negotiations does not mean that there won't need to continue to have things happen here. It is true that both the United States and Iran have needs here for things to get to a better position. What's hopeful about this current moment is that the U.S. was so effective in taking out that top tier of leadership. It was actually difficult to get the high level of negotiations with the approval from the leadership. That they're making this success happen now, it is indicative that what the White House thought this weekend, which is that they were nearing this level of talks, that they were going to have success, but they had to give that new leadership an ability to be able to sign on to it, that prediction has been borne out.
I want to also point out, bottom right of your screen, you can see that we are making very clear, we're going to hear directly from the White House here through Secretary Scott Bessent. He's going to be leading the White House briefing at 2 o'clock Eastern time, about 54 minutes from now. Quick look at the markets and how things are reacting right now. Pretty muted reaction. The Dow is about flat on the day. S&P 500 and NASDAQ are up. But you can see how things changed as the report from Axios came and now the confirmation from Fox News that we moved into the green. A quick look at oil markets as well. We did see oil markets turn lower on the news. Oil now at $88 a barrel, Mollie, just below 89, I should say. And Brent crude is coming down as well. I'm looking at probably a delayed price. This is if it is real time, but we are back below $90 a barrel, Mollie. Here's the details, what we know so far. On this U.S. and Iran 60-day deal. It extends the ceasefire. It launches negotiations on Iran's nuclear program. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz will be unrestricted. It includes a mechanism to help Iran start receiving goods and humanitarian aid. But to Trey Yingst's reporting just now, there's big questions about what the devil may be in the details. And how do you enforce this?
Well, just first off, the situation in the United States is important because the gas prices were so bad heading into summer. This becomes a real political issue for a war that already has not had the broad political support that you usually see at this stage of a war the Americans are joined into. But it is also so true that the Iranian economy has been obliterated through this shutdown of the Strait that has brought them to the brink in a way that they weren't with previous sanctions. But they understand that the United States has political concerns, Donald Trump and the Republicans have political concerns. But even repositioning the situation, I mean, the situation with the Strait of Hormuz that's so interesting is it's not a big passageway for United States goods. It's huge for Europe. But Europe has sort of been content to have the United States make the Strait of Hormuz its own problem, enforce things there. We've continued to have an outsized role in protecting shipping routes. But one of the things this war showed us is just how much free riding goes on from Europe toward the U.S.'s posture on these shipping routes. Donald Trump has made this very clear, both in his first administration and this administration, about how that's not a tenable situation going forward, that Europe gains so much from our protection of these things, and they need to step up and handle more of their own defense posture, more of their own concern about the problem of Iran. And one hopes that going forward, as negotiations continue, that continues to be something that's emphasized by the U.S. toward its European allies.
So as far as having trust in this deal and trust in those that we are negotiating and making this deal with, that becomes a bigger and bigger question as well, Mollie.
Well, and the White House made it clear this weekend, even as they were hopeful about what we're hearing happening here today, that if there are violations, if there are problems where Iran is not complying with the terms of the upcoming deal, that everything's on the table from the United States perspective.
All right, Mollie Hemingway joining us on the breaking news. Mollie, really appreciate it. Thank you. All right, John?
Let's continue to dig deep on this by bringing in retired Vice Admiral Mark Fox, former Deputy CENTCOM Commander. Admiral, good to have you with us. What do you make of this idea of a 60-day pause for negotiations with a memorandum of understanding? It looks like being agreed to, though we haven't heard from the president yet.
Well, I'm skeptic. You know, I just heard the conversation there. I don't think that the Iranians negotiate in good faith. We are the ones who initiated the ceasefire in the first place. And so when they have egregious violations where they try to put mines in the water or shoot missiles, I think they ought to suffer some severe consequences of it. So this plays, in my opinion, towards the Iranian side in terms of giving them more time. That's all I think that they've been doing all along. They were happy with the ceasefire, and I think they're happy with a 60-day extension.
Yeah,
so
I'm sure they are.
I personally color me skeptical.
Yeah, well, you know, the Iranians they're experts at playing for time, if nothing else. You know, as you point out, the Iranians are still playing fast and loose with their missiles. Here's what CENTCOM put out just a short time ago, 10:17 p.m. Eastern Time on May 27th, Iran launched a ballistic missile toward Kuwait that was successfully intercepted by Kuwaiti forces. This egregious ceasefire violation by the Iranian regime occurred hours after the Iranian forces launched 5 one-way attack drones that posed a clear threat in and near the Strait of Hormuz. All drones were successfully intercepted by U.S. forces, which also prevented a 6th drone launch from an Iranian ground control site in Bandar Abbas. I mean, you look at that as these negotiations are going on, and you get the sense that this Iranian regime, I mean, these guys are irredeemable.
I completely agree. They haven't changed their stripes, John. They're dedicated to this idea of this Islamic republic, this theocracy. They don't care how many of their own people die or are in horrible economic conditions as long as they stay in power. I see this as a generational opportunity to end a 47-year war that they've declared on us on our terms. And by kicking the can down the road by a 60-day extension I don't think is the right way to go. But
all right.
The president is in charge, and he'll make that call.
Yeah, forgive me for interrupting, but if this isn't the way to go, what is the way to go to end that 47-year reign of terror? What would you do if you were in charge?
I would put what I would call the unblinking eye, a never 24/7, 365 posture of surveillance and reconnaissance along the Strait of Hormuz, airborne, drones, helicopters, surveillance aircraft, and have ordnance in the air that would, if they ever send out small boats to attack innocent merchant mariners, then we would prevent that from happening. We should not give the Iranians the agency to say that they do or do not control the Strait of Hormuz. We should force that issue so that the freedom of navigation is for all and not allow the Iranians to have that kind of agency here.
Yeah, I mean, you put the unblinking eye of Sauron on them and you back it up with military hardware, but what do you do about the regime itself?
Well, you've got to be consistent, I think, in terms of them suffering consequences, serious consequences, when they attack, when they cause mischief. You can kind of see how if they start playing this thing so that everyone, the Omanis, let's say, make a deal with Iran, and then the Emiratis or the Saudis, if we are irresolute, if we don't come across in a very, very resolute fashion, then I think the regional partners and the regional neighbors will not be able to, it'll be very detrimental to all of our interests.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, we're just in the early minutes of this, so we'll see how it progresses. Admiral, thanks for being with us this afternoon. Appreciate it.
Glad to be here.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.